when you look at a permission management program,
Yeah.
like I'm a company, I want to go about starting the whole concept of permission management of my organization. Where would you naturally start? You'll start with your more sensitive resources.
Yeah.
What is that usually called? That's called PAM, privileged access management, right?
Yeah.
So that's often the first step that companies take in their permission management program is starting with the more sensitive resources. The approach around these more sensitive resources is usually what's often called the just-in-time approach. And it's an ephemeral concept of ephemerality of these more sensitive resources, the permission or access to these more sensitive resources. So that's kind of usually where companies like starting. That's where they like a place where you can get value quickly. These are products that are easier to deploy. The time to value is quick. It's easier to see success there.
Access management. One would have thought identity access management has been solved for years, but today I am having a conversation with Ron from Entitle because we haven't spoken about entitlement enough in the world of cloud. So why not talk about it today? Things like why is it hard to manage a lot of identities and access in a cloud context, the different kinds of identities that can exist in a cloud context, and what you could be doing if you're starting an identity program in cloud. All that and a lot more in this episode. I hope you enjoy this. If you want more episodes on cloud security, definitely check that on www.cloudsecuritypodcast. Or if you would like us to cover more interviews and training on topics like identity access management in cloud, definitely leave that as a comment or email us on info@cloudsecuritypodcast.gb. And as always, if you know someone who's probably working on identity access management, please share the video with them. And if you are here for the second or third time, definitely drop us a like or comment on YouTube. But if you're listening to this on audio, thank you so much for keeping us close to your ear. And if you have a moment, I would really appreciate if you can drop us a review or rating, and I would talk to you soon. See you in the next episode. Peace. Welcome to another episode of Cloud Security Podcast. Today, we're talking about my favorite topic, because I started in identity access management. So I'm really excited about this. For this, I have Ron. Thank you for coming to the show, Ron.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. And for people who don't know, Ron, what's your background? And I mean, how you got to where you are today?
The long answer or the short version?
Whichever one you pick.
I grew up in Dallas. Last few years been spending in Tel Aviv. Started my journey in cybersecurity in the Army. Did security research and development and, all the kind of low-level research stuff. And when Avi, my co-founder, and I finished our service, we realized that many of the core challenges were in the permission management space.
Right.
So that's why we decided to focus on that space as kind of the next core challenge of what we felt was yet to be solved.
Yep.
And that's kind of what led us to start Entitle, and kind of that snowballed into what we're doing today.
Awesome. And I think identity access management, because we find that a lot of the cloud security conversations, a lot about vulnerability. Hey, we found this vulnerability in cloud. We found that vulnerability in cloud. Identity and access management is usually looked at as a space that is, actually, maybe if you can explain what IAM is for you, that would be a great preface for my question that's about to happen. For people who do not know what IAM is, how would you describe it?
So IAM, first of all, identity and access management, right? That's the whole concept of governing who has access to what and who is the identity inside the different applications. So centralization of identity or using identity providers, SSO, is kind of usually that first step that usually often people think about and talk about in IAM, but there are obviously other parts of that. Privileged access management takes the more ephemeral approach. IGA, governance and administration, is the more visibility and actual operational day-to-day. So definitely a multifaceted, has a lot of different aspects to it, which is why often it takes huge teams to actually manage all that process. I think people often think about IAM as a subcategory of cybersecurity. It can almost be thought of as like its own world, right? I feel like it's consuming enough and large enough to be in parallel.
I agree. It's funny because I started my career, a cybersecurity career in IAM, and I used to think that, this is not going to be like a thing. But to what you said, because my thinking was, this is a subset. I want to learn all these other things, but there are companies with dedicated teams just for IAM as well out there, right? And I'll be curious to know from your side, because it's a problem that's been there for a long time. A lot of people over here in this would go, isn't that already solved? Why is IAM such a topic now when we're talking about in the cloud world?
Well, this goes back to where you started your first question of vulnerabilities, IAM, what's the relationship? I think that companies are realizing over time that, misconfigured permissions or mismanaged permissions is a vulnerability. And when you look at all the major compromises that happened to the largest of companies over the last few years, Uber and Okta, I think, are two large examples that happened fairly recently. It was boring old stuff. Okta, what it was customer success teams having access to a very wide range of environments and one of them getting compromised. That is the basis of IAM. That's the bread and butter. First of all, it's proof that we still have not solved that issue. The fact that the biggest of compromises are these boring old things. But second of all, I think that a lot of industry changes have opened the opportunity to solve this problem at a wider scale. I think that, CNAPP, CSPM, cloud security
Yeah.
was kind of that first step in realizing that misconfiguration of something is a vulnerability. It doesn't have to be 0-day. It can be just a setting that's not configured correctly. And it's very similar in the IAM world. If a permission is misconfigured, that in itself is a vulnerability. And so how do you go about orchestrating, managing that whole process, especially as you take on more SaaS applications, more infrastructure? People are opening themselves up to multi-clouds, managing that, maybe you're really great at AWS, you bring on GCP, that's a whole nother world. And
Yeah.
as you start diversifying your assets, it just becomes more and more challenging.
Interesting you say that because most people would think that, yeah, SSO is like the reason, right? I mean, doesn't that mean we'll solve the problem? The complexity of multi-cloud, having multiple SaaS providers and managing access across that as well. So it's not just identity access management is a lot more complex now than what it used to be.
Well, I think there are aspects of it that become more challenging. Just to give a concrete example, SSO has become very widely adopted. And so the whole concept of local users and things like that, those are becoming, things of the past. I'm not going to say they're totally behind us, but definitely things that, all of a sudden SSO is something that's taken more and more for granted. But now that we have that basis behind us, we can start thinking about the more granular, the more forward thinking, the more specific aspect of permissions inside the different application. That's kind of that next step, right? The governance, administration, permission, provisioning inside the applications themselves.
Interesting. And how would you describe entitlement management? Because I think we were talking about this offline as well about entitlement management as a space.
Yeah.
And we spoke about IAM as in identity access management at the top level. You can kind of go granular even further as well. That's how complex this field is. How would you describe entitlement management?
It's interesting because, first of all, I think because the space is really in its early innings, it's evolving and changing often. Companies come to me and they say, we're looking for Keem, and they mean totally different things. So, I mean, let's put the term aside real quick and let's talk about the problem statement and the different aspects of it. I think that generally there are two sides to things. Governance, the more visibility, understanding of who has access to what, identifying overprivileged, identifying permissions that are not in use, things like that is kind of generally considered more on the visibility, maybe even cloud security side of things. And then there's the administration, the actual operational day-to-day of how employees get access. What is the process they go through? How do you define these policies? And that's, first of all, they go hand in hand. I spoke with a French CISO a while ago. He gave me, I'm not going to try to imitate the French accent, but he said, you can't show me the shit without giving me a broom. You can't give me a broom without showing me the shit. So the two very much go together. And so anyways, generally to say, Keem can tackle both of them, can be just the visibility side, maybe just the provisioning side. Let's put the term aside. We'll let Gardner and KuppingerCole define what that means. But generally, I'll say that those are the two sides of permission management that still need to be covered.
And is that for every level of a company? Like, would a startup have to consider that compared to like a big enterprise? Where do you see entitlement management becoming more of a challenge? At what scale, I guess?
Yeah. So I think, when you're really early in your process, you're 10 employees, 30 employees, that's probably not top priority for you. You're probably just managing users through Okta, and that's probably good enough.
Yeah.
There comes a size where you start having hundreds or thousands of employees and tens or hundreds of SaaS applications and different resources. Then it's that matrix becomes really large, right? If you have like a 10 by 10 matrix, it's fairly easy to manage. 1,000 by 1,000 matrix, that starts to become really, really challenging. And so that's where automation starts really showing its strength, is being able to define these policies across different infrastructures, across different business units. That's where it becomes more challenging. I think that when you're talking about a cloud native company, cloud resource intensive companies, they have one set of challenges, right? That matrix is kind of fairly vanilla. They're early in their process. When you're talking about a more enterprise company, they already have a lot of legacy that they brought with them. They have a lot of homegrown solutions, things like that. And then that becomes its own issue, right? It's like, how do you juggle between this new era of cloud infrastructure, SaaS applications that I'm adopting and what I'm using there versus all this old stuff that I still need to maintain, I still need to manage. And I think that what we're seeing in a lot of these companies is they end up having almost two different business units, two different organizations tackling them separately. You have the IAM team that's tackling the more corporate workforce identity stuff. And then you have the cloud security side tackling the more cloud identity stuff. Exactly. AWS and databases and SaaS applications.
What are some of the use cases that people would kind of start? Because I imagine people listening to this going, I think what Ron's saying, it makes sense. But what are some of the use cases when the people start seeing it? They should come say, oh, that's my permission management challenge. Like,
Are there certain use cases that you think of? I think we were talking about just-in-time provisioning and all of that. Are there use cases that you think that would become a challenge at scale in cloud?
Yeah, totally. So first of all, when you look at a permission management program,
Yeah.
like I'm a company, I want to go about starting the whole concept of permission management in my organization. Where would you naturally start? You'll start with your more sensitive resources.
Yep.
What is that usually called? That's called PAM, Privileged Access Management, right?
Yep.
So that's often the first step that companies take in their permission management program, is starting with the more sensitive resources. The approach around these more sensitive resources is usually what's often called a just-in-time approach. And it's an ephemeral concept of ephemerality of these more sensitive resources, the permission or access to these more sensitive resources. So that's kind of usually where companies like starting. And that's a place where you can get value quickly. These are products that are easier to deploy. The time to value is quick. It's easier to see success there. And I think that what's happening in the cloud world is that the whole concept of privilege, of sensitive assets, companies are realizing it's not a binary. The whole concept of privileged access is not a binary yes or no. It's not privileged or not privileged. It's a spectrum. There are things that are more sensitive. There are things that are less sensitive. And so how do you manage that over time? I think that's where permission management programs start to evolve, right? Is you start with this just-in-time approach around sensitive resources. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's the first thing you do. And then you start to expand into the rest of the organization, the rest of the applications that obviously need to be managed just as much as the more sensitive aspects.
Would that be different between, say, an on-premise world versus the cloud world?
Totally. I think that, privileged access management in the on-prem world takes on a slightly different meaning. People often, when you say privileged access management, they often think jump servers.
Yes.
They think, right, how do I wrap the authentication of legacy systems for very sensitive aspects? And so that's, I think, one side of things. I think that's getting solved over time, right? You're having less local accounts, Azure PIM as a simple example, right? How do I assign roles in Active Directory in an ephemeral manner? That's a simple approach in a cloud manner. That's actually no different than any other permission management, right? The whole concept of, who's an admin in Active Directory is not that dissimilar to who has access to a SharePoint website.
Yeah.
They're both permissions that I'm provisioning and deprovisioning based off of attributes and other aspects that are slightly more dynamic.
Yeah, and well put together as well. I mean, that's kind of most of the technical questions I had. Where can people find you on the internet to connect and talk more about the entitlement space?
I mean, Entitle.io, obviously hopefully that's a fairly indicative name. That's straight and to the point. We try to keep things simple and straightforward, not too much marketing fluff. And so obviously our website, happy to reach out. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn, Ron Neeson.
Yeah.
Looking forward to talking and having some more interesting conversations. What's beautiful about Black Hat, we're here at Black Hat. Beautiful about Black Hat is just having a lot of security practitioners that are really happy to share their perspectives. And I think that's where we thrive as startups, is staying on the cutting edge, understanding what we could be doing differently. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be called out on it.
That's pretty awesome, man. And I'll leave the LinkedIn profile in the shorts as well. But thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on, and thank you everyone for watching. I'll see you next episode.